Okay, here's today's list of representative actors. In the first half of the class, we'll hear about Charlemagne in the Carolingian Renaissance. Carolingian is just an adjective derived from his name in Latin, Carolus Magnus. Charlemagne is the most impressive hero of the early Middle Ages in Northern Europe, and the events of his day had consequences that would play out for centuries. Alcuin of York can represent cultural achievement in his day. Charlemagne's day, he was one of many scholars and missionaries who came from the British Isles in the 8th and 9th centuries to help civilize the Germans. Charles the Bald was Charlemagne's grandson, and the most famous scholar of his day, John Scotus Erigena, another Briton, probably Irish, was at his court. As we'll see, Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor by the Pope, but it's usually argued that the continuous history of the Holy Roman Empire as a uniquely German institution begins with Otto I, and after the break we'll cross the Rhine to hear about him. His grandson was Otto III, whose short reign produced more than its share of interesting events and objets d'art, and we'll wind up with the reign of the Emperor Henry II, also known for his art patronage and for the fact that he's the only emperor who was also a saint. So last week we heard how Pepin the Short put the last of the Merovingian kings of the Franks into a monastery in 751 and established a new dynasty, the Carolingian, named after his son, as I said. This little bronze work, less than a foot high, is thought to represent Charlemagne, the son of Pepin the Short. Although that identification is open to question, one thing that's always said about Charlemagne is that he was big. But if this is Charlemagne and to scale, he was really big. His biographer Einhard says he was 7 of his own feet tall, which would make me, if I were 7 of my feet tall, 7 feet tall. And if Charlemagne were 7 feet tall, he would have been regarded as a member of a different species. The usual view is that he was, however, at least over 6 feet, and in any case awfully tall to have had a father called Pepin the Short. The name of his mother, Bertha Broadfoot, suggests she may have been more the source of his size, I think. The Cathedral of Aachen, which has his bones, refuses to have them examined for so trivial a purpose as the determination of his height. When Pepin died in 768, he divided his property in the Merovingian fashion, which had been so destructive, between Charlemagne and the latter's brother Carloman, and if Carloman hadn't died soon in 771, and some suspect Charlemagne of involvement in this, Charlemagne would probably have never become Charlemagne, the man who, at least transiently, was to unite more of Western Europe than anyone since the fall of the Roman Empire, and no one after him would rule as much of it until Napoleon. As a work of art, this little statue is a rare example of something that might be called freestanding sculpture of this period. There really is almost no freestanding sculpture done in the Middle Ages. This is the so-called Sword of Charlemagne in the Louvre, but that's just the name of it rather than an accurate description. The empire Charlemagne established was the result much more of conquest than diplomacy, and few did spend more time sword in hand, I suppose, in the Middle Ages than Charlemagne. His first big campaign was against his own father-in-law, Desiderius, the king of the Lombards. Charlemagne had married the daughter of Desiderius, but after the death of Charlemagne's brother Carloman, the latter's widow convinced Desiderius to support the claims of her sons against Charlemagne, and from 771 to 774, Charlemagne fought against the Lombards, the campaign culminating in the taking of Pavia, memorably described in the work of another of Charlemagne's Carolingian biographers, Notker the Stammerer. Charlemagne, he says, appeared with his army before Pavia, and Desiderius, looking from the walls, could see nothing but iron. Iron helmets, iron swords, iron armor, and horses the color of iron. "Oh no," he wailed, "alas for the iron." He surrendered and was made to take the vows of a monk. Gibbon has no sympathy for him. He says Desiderius was prone to begin wars without reflection and to terminate them without glory. What happened to Carloman's widow and her sons is unknown. They are not heard of again. This is a 12th century statue of Charlemagne, which is in the Church of St. Johann in Münster in Switzerland. This church also has some of the most important surviving Carolingian frescoes, which, unlike this statue, are more or less contemporary with him, and about which we'll hear in a while. Charlemagne's married life was very complex, and the cause, at least indirectly, of a lot of trouble for him. His first wife, Himmeltrude, was sent away, whatever that means, and he also similarly ditched Desiree, his second wife, the daughter of Desiderius, which helped lead the latter to support the claims of Carloman's widow and sons against him, as I've just said. He was to be married at least 2 more times and have an assortment of concubines and children. As Gibbon says, among his virtues, chastity was not the most conspicuous. The abandoning of Desiree also led to trouble with Bavaria, about which we'll hear shortly. In 778, Charlemagne became involved in his most famous campaign, that in Spain against the Muslims. Invited by some rebels to help overthrow the Caliph Abdurrahman I in Cordova, Charlemagne crossed the Pyrenees and besieged Saragossa, but he couldn't take it and had to recross the Pyrenees through the pass at Roncesvalles, which you see here. Charlemagne's rear guard was attacked and destroyed, but by whom is still something of a mystery. The whole aborted Spanish episode culminating in this debacle is the subject of the greatest French poem of the Middle Ages, La Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland. In this anonymous epic, the hero Roland and a few of his friends are attacked by 100,000 Muslims and do manage to hold them off for a considerable time. But even though Roland blows his horn so loud his brains fall out his ears, Charlemagne doesn't come to the rescue until too late. This is the 13th century Roland window at Chartres, which depicts the climax of the story. Roland has blown the horn and then tries to break his sword, Durandal, over a rock so it won't be taken as a trophy by the infidels. However, it won't break because it has a tooth of St. Peter and a hair of the Virgin in the hilt. The poem is written in a Norman dialect that someone fluent in modern French can handle with a little help. It is essentially the poem with which the history of French literature begins, although, as we'll see, the French language had begun to distance itself from German and Latin as early as Charlemagne's own day, some 300 years before the poem was written. Henry Adams says that no one should try to translate the Song of Roland today, which is something that could, of course, be said about almost any great poem in a foreign language. But that didn't stop C.K. Scott Moncrief from producing one of the real disasters in the history of translation in his version. What is alleged to be the very sword of Roland is today stuck in another rock at Roc Amador in central France. Moncrief is best known for his translation of Proust's A la Recherche du Temps Perdu, but can you imagine anything more different in atmosphere from the Song of Roland? Mon Dieu! When Charlemagne finally hears Roland's horn and turns his army around, Moncrief has him say to his knights, "Nimbly canter." No real man ever said nimbly canter to anyone. Roland's adventures, like those of Tristan and Parsifal and the Knights of the Round Table, became popular subjects for poets all over Europe. In the Renaissance, Boiardo wrote Orlando, that is, Roland in Love. And Ariosto's Orlando Furioso is considered the greatest poem of the Italian Renaissance if you put Dante back in the Middle Ages. As I mentioned earlier, Charlemagne's discarding of Desiree also caused him trouble in Bavaria. Desiree's sister was married to Tassilo, the king of the Bavarians, and she helped persuade him to violate a treaty with her erstwhile brother-in-law. By 788, however, Charlemagne had forced his abdication, and he spent the rest of his life at Kremsmünster, a monastery which he'd founded in Austria, and which still owns this chalice which he donated to it. It's one of the oldest such things anywhere, and may be the oldest still in its original home. John the Baptist and Saint Theodolinda, the Bavarian princess who became Queen of the Lombards, can be seen on the base. Theodolinda was never widely recognized as a saint, but there are, of course, many locally revered saints who still have loyal followings, despite the lack of any official recognition. It wasn't until the 12th century that a formal process of canonization, that is, a formal process for recognizing the saintliness of someone, was adopted. And it wasn't until the 17th century that the modern system was adopted, requiring a detailed examination of the candidate's resume. The Pope himself can still recognize a saint by fiat, however. In the 780s, Charlemagne also became involved in a bloody conflict with the Saxons in Germany. The Saxons were not Christians and were massacred wholesale on more than one occasion, although probably more for political than religious reasons. Charlemagne is said to have presented this reliquary as a gift to the rebel leader Witikind after his baptism in 785. But that was not the end of the conflict, and Saxony remained a problem for him until after a final campaign in 804. Reliquaries like this are among the most important works of art to survive from the early Middle Ages. They were, of course, entirely unknown to classical antiquity, and after the 11th century, by which time people like the Franks had become well settled, such things as architecture and sculpture become far more impressive. The finest artists didn't make these things anymore. These things contained, of course, relics, typically bones of the saints, which were thought to possess various sorts of spiritual or miraculous power. This is the reliquary of St. Stephen, now in the Vienna Art History Museum. As I said, they typically contained bones of the saints, but others were thought to contain things like feathers from the Archangel Gabriel dropped at the Annunciation, pieces of the charcoal that had roasted St. Lawrence, or in this case, some of the rocks with which St. Stephen was stoned to death. Such things are, of course, impossible to document, and the Church has wisely chosen not to get involved in most claims about authenticity. There are some interesting cases which helped establish the reputation of various relics, however. Gregory of Tours mentions going on a journey, taking an arm bone of St. Vincent with him as a sort of insurance policy. When he was waylaid by some bandits, he pulled out the arm bone and waved it at them. And since they, no less than he, believed in the efficacy of relics, they immediately ran off, and Gregory chalked up another miracle to the arm bone of St. Vincent. Here, about the size of a tennis ball, is one of the most splendid surviving Carolingian reliquaries, the so-called Talisman of Charlemagne, which was allegedly found around his neck when Otto III opened the coffin in the year 1000. It's now in the treasury of the Cathedral of Reims. It still has pieces of the true cross behind crystal, and it's made of gold decorated with semi-precious and precious stones. Precious stones were rarely used for this kind of thing in Charlemagne's day, but the green stones here are emeralds about a quarter-inch in diameter. Charlemagne maintained a close alliance with the papacy throughout his reign, and in his wars with Desiderius and Tassilo, he was acting directly as the Pope's defender. And he was acting as the more general champion of Christianity then, as a sort of crusader in his eastward push through the Saxons, Avars, and still more obscure barbarians. You may remember that as a de facto theologian, he also championed the inclusion of the filioque clause in the Credo, which widened the distance between the Roman and Byzantine churches, and he also suppressed the Gallican liturgy, the native Frankish liturgy, in accordance with the wishes of the Pope. This is a document with Charlemagne's signature in the form of a monogram at the lower left. He was very interested in books and education, astrology and therefore astronomy, the arts such as they were in his day, particularly music maybe. But according to his friend and biographer Einhard, he never became literate. Einhard says that he began too late in life to master reading and writing, but part of the problem was the fact that he put off his studying till he was in bed at the end of the day, I think, and pretty soon he was asleep on his tablets. He did establish what is often called the first free public system of education, requiring all monasteries and churches to have someone available to teach anyone who wanted to learn Latin, the knowledge of which was the sine qua non of progress in any other area of education. He also established what's known as the Palace School, sort of the Sorbonne of its day, for the education of members of his own and other chosen noble families. It was under the direction of the Englishman Alcuin of York, one of the most important scholars of the age. Much of his time was spent on reconciling and editing various texts of Jerome's Latin Bible, on a catechism, and on the introduction of votive masses in honor of various saints, which were assigned to days he designated for their celebration. We'll hear some evidence of his work in this direction in a few minutes. In 796, he became abbot of Saint-Martin de Tours, and is given credit for their inventing the script called Carolingian minuscule, which is the ancestor of many modern fonts, as we call them now. This is the cover of the Oxford Gospel, now in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. As I mentioned earlier, even though the early Middle Ages mark a low point in the history of European literature, the books made during this period are perhaps the finest examples of the bookmaker's craft ever produced. Charlemagne visited Ravenna probably at least twice, and he or someone with him must have seen the mosaic which we saw earlier there depicting Christ in just this attitude. Among the other scholars around Charlemagne were Einhard, whom I've already mentioned as his most important biographer, and Paul the Deacon, another hymn writer like Alcuin, and also valuable because of his knowledge of Greek. Charlemagne met Paul the Deacon on a visit to Monte Cassino and persuaded him to come north. Einhard had been educated at the great abbey of Fulda by St. Boniface, who was, like Alcuin and St. Willibrord, about whom we'll hear more in a minute, an Englishman. The English play a very significant part. The English, the Scots, the Irish, a very, very important part in the evangelization and civilization of Central Europe, Germany in the Carolingian age. The Dagolf Psalter, the cover of which you see here in the Louvre, was commissioned by Charlemagne as a gift for Pope Hadrian IV. A gospel book like the one we just saw, the Oxford Gospel, contained the Gospels, of course, and a psalter like this contained a selection of the Psalms. Almost no one had a complete Bible, but the scribes of Charlemagne's day made so many copies of classical Latin texts that Kenneth Clark says that nothing that made it to his day has been lost since. Alcuin himself defended this industry, arguing that it was necessary to mix the wine of the classics with the honey of Scripture. The pages of the Dagolf Psalter are now in Vienna, and you see one page here. It may be that you see here the combined influence of the classical and Anglo-Saxon traditions on Carolingian bookmaking. The letters look like they could have come right off a monument in the Forum, but the decoration is pure Anglo-Saxon. It's possible that Alcuin and the other English scholars around at the time were responsible for introducing the Anglo-Saxon part of this style. As I mentioned a moment ago, Charlemagne suppressed the Gallican liturgy, but two memorable hymns by Venantius Fortunatus were included in the Gregorian liturgy. We heard Pange Lingua last time, and now we'll hear Vexilla Regis Prodeunt, Let the Standard of the King Advance. This is used at Vespers in the Divine Office from Passion Sunday to Maundy Thursday. Here's another similar page from a manuscript of the works of St. Gregory. The ornamentation of the arch looks like it was painted in England for sure, but it wasn't. Whether or not this style of illumination was due to English influence, it never dominated Carolingian bookmaking and died out quickly. Here's the St. Mark page from the Godescalc Gospel in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Like the Dagolf Psalter we saw earlier, this is a book commissioned by Charlemagne himself. And this is the style of page painting which became the most typical of his day, and it lacks the abstract reticulation of the Anglo-Saxon style altogether. We're going to hear another important piece of music now. As I mentioned earlier, Alcuin wrote texts, poems, in honor of various saints, and these became part of the liturgy of the monastic service, the office used in the celebration of the feast days of these saints. His best-known such work is his treatment of the life of his fellow Englishman, St. Willibrord, who founded the great Abbey of Echternach, and you're hearing part of this now in a plain chant version that goes back to the late 9th century. You can sort of think of it as a Carolingian equivalent to the oratorio. Here's St. Mark again from the Ebo Gospel in the Bibliothèque Municipale in Epernay in France. This is a memorable treatment of the saint in an idiosyncratic style that makes it almost look as though he's just sat down in the electric chair. This is a page from the Saint-Germain-des-Prés Psalter, now in Stuttgart in the Landesbibliothek. And here you can see the use of the Carolingian minuscule that is said to have been invented by Alcuin, and which Kenneth Clark calls the most beautiful lettering ever invented. Here's another example in a Carolingian manuscript containing the rule of Saint Benedict. As I mentioned earlier, too, one could claim that both the finest sculpture and finest painting of the Carolingian age are to be found decorating books, and there is, in fact, very little that can be called sculpture or painting up from that age which doesn't decorate books. This fresco is on the wall of the church of St. Johann, St. John at Münster in Switzerland, and depicts the flight into Egypt. It looks almost like a cartoon for a mosaic, and it is sometimes suggested that wall paintings of the Carolingian age were viewed as sort of inferior substitutes for mosaics. However, the bottom line is that while a few impressive examples survive or are known, mosaic decoration was not widely or enduringly popular north of the Alps, nor for that matter was fresco decoration to be that popular either. At least none of the great artists of the north were to paint much in that medium. Stained glass will eventually become the wall decoration of choice in the north. There may well be climatological factors involved here. Damp, cold climates aren't friendly to fresco, and large windows were more appealing in northern countries as sources of light and maybe a little warmth. Very few Carolingian buildings survive, but if the architectural complex of which this is a plan survived, it would be something to see. This is the celebrated plan of St. Gall, still in the St. Gall Library in Switzerland. Some think Einhard may actually have made it or supervised the making of it. Others think it was made at Reichenau, about which we'll hear in a bit. The usual view is that what we have here is a sort of blueprint for an ideal monastery which was never built, though some think it did inspire the Carolingian abbey at St. Gall itself. The church on the plan would have been 300 feet long and much longer than any actual abbey church built in the 9th century. The date of the plan is put at around 815. Though some such churches, like that of Fulda in Germany or the Abbey of Sentula north of Paris, were apparently 200 feet long or so. This is a drawing based on the original, which lets you see a little bit more of what's there. In 1979, Walter Horn and Ernest Bourne of UC Berkeley produced a 3-volume book on this plan that won all sorts of awards for scholarship and bookmaking. The Plan of St. Gall. Don't look for it at Borders, though. Its original price was $3,500. The title is a bit misleading because the subject of this monumental accomplishment is really more the whole Carolingian world, and most of the information in Horn and Bourne's book comes from the wide-ranging research of the authors rather than from this plan. Horn's protege, Lorna Price, calls the plan one of the greatest cultural and historical records of Western civilization. But that's a wild exaggeration. By itself, it tells us very little. Again, most everything interesting, apart from the arrangement of the buildings here, is derived from sources other than the plan itself. It is important to notice that the west end of this church at the left is very different from the west ends of 5th and 6th century churches we've seen in Rome and Ravenna. It has no portico, and it does have flanking towers that make it look more like the ancestor of later French churches than the descendant of earlier Italian ones. This is a drawing of what the great abbey church at Sentula, built some 25 years before the plan of St. Gall was drawn, looked like. And Nicholas Pevsner calls it northern, original, and unprecedented. The abbot responsible for it, Engelbert, was, in fact, although he was an abbot, secretly married to Charlemagne's daughter, one of Charlemagne's daughters. The impressive west front is again without a portico, although it may have had an atrium, and it has, though somewhat less obviously, the flanking tower arrangement you see at in the plan of St. Gall. It's not possible to reconstruct here the whole arrangement of the abbey complex, and one valuable thing about the plan of St. Gall, too, is the way it does make clear the size of the whole complex and what I guess we could call the rational or regular way in which all the buildings were positioned, in contrast to what we know about the kind of chaotic monasteries earlier in Byzantium and Egypt. The mid-9th century west front or westwork of the German abbey of Corvey in Westphalia, about 20 miles southwest of Hildesheim, about which more later, is one of the largest pieces of Carolingian architecture still surviving, and it looks a lot like what Sentula's west front was like. Corvey's towers have what are called bishop's mitre roofs, a feature that will become common in the German Romanesque. The church beyond the westwork here is Baroque now, though. This is Germany de Prés in the Loire Valley, and the east end of this abbey church is also Carolingian. It was built by Theodulf, Bishop of Orleans, another of the most important figures of Charlemagne's day. This was clearly a low-end project compared to Sentula or the church in the planet Sangol, but with only a couple of exceptions, surviving Carolingian buildings are much more like these than like those. Theodulf, who was one of Charlemagne's closest advisors, is also thought to be the author of the hymn Gloria Laus et Honor, Glory, Praise, and Honor, used in the Palm Sunday service. It's a processional hymn, and preserved in the version we'll hear in the Thomaskirche Graduale in Leipzig. Bach is supposed to have drawn some inspiration from this collection of music, if not from this particular piece. While we hear it, we'll see a few of the other surviving Carolingian buildings. This is the interior of Germany to Pray, dark with few windows, so at this point we're a long way from the glass-filled cathedrals of the 13th century. The mosaic in the apse is a rare one north of the Alps. This is a closer view of the apse mosaic, the subject of which isn't certain. It may represent the Ark of the Covenant, in which case it would be a rare example of an Old Testament subject serving as the dominant decoration in a Christian church. This is the gatehouse of the Abbey at Lorsch, north of Heidelberg. It's the only part of the complex surviving. It looks just like what one would expect of a Teutonic variation on the Roman triumphal arch theme. The room above the arches was recently found to have its original painted decoration beneath layers of later plaster and paint. This is the church of Saints Petrus and Marcellinus, which Einhard himself had built at Steinbach in Odenwald. It's very similar to Theodulf's church at Germany to Pray. This is a view of Aachen as it looks today, with the cathedral in the center, and of all surviving Carolingian buildings, this, though much damaged and restored over the centuries, is clearly the most impressive. Charlemagne visited Italy in 800, and on this and probably at least one other such trip, he visited Ravenna, as I mentioned earlier, and he must have been impressed by San Vitale there, because if one takes away the spire at the west and the choir at the east, which were added in the 14th century, this cathedral is very similar in plan to San Vitale. Charlemagne's palace at Aachen was where the Aachen Rathaus, or City Hall, is now, and some parts of the towers, especially of the one at the east end, might go back to his day. In this picture you can see the Rathaus from the cathedral or palatine, that is, palace chapel, as which it served in Charlemagne's day. If any place can be called Charlemagne's White House, his official residence, or at least his favorite residence, this was it. Charlemagne was a diligent administrator of the affairs of his empire from here. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, some say that the origin of the feudal system can be traced all the way back as far as Diocletian, but the usual view is that it was essentially Frankish in origin. and became well established in Charlemagne's day. Powerful men called comites, companions or counts in the Carolingian period, counts, that would be our word to translate comites, were given counties or feuds, or as they were usually called, fiefs, in exchange for various services, often military, which they promised to render in return. Charlemagne kept tight control of the system, but it wasn't to be long before many fiefs became something very much like little hereditary kingdoms, and there was to be much squabbling for centuries over what rights counts and other fief holders were to have, and what rights kings were to have over them, their fiefs, and the people who lived on them. Here you see the cathedral now from the north. Every 2 years Charlemagne summoned all of his vassals or feudatories, those who held fiefs from him, to assess the state of the realm. And he also had a sort of FBI, which was made up of his missi dominici, or royal agents, who made regular visits throughout his territory and reported back on matters that concerned His Majesty. Here's the facade of the cathedral now. As I mentioned, Charlemagne was in Italy in 800, and on Christmas Day something happened that has puzzled historians ever since. He went to Mass at St. Peter's, and at some point Pope Leo III placed a crown on his head and proclaimed him Roman Emperor. Einhard says that Charlemagne told him he had no idea this was going to happen. But this is a little hard to believe. It must have flattered him at least to be ranked with Augustus and Trajan, even if it gave him no new territory or actual power. In any case, the history of the Holy Roman Empire, as distinct from the old pagan Roman Empire, begins in some sense with this affair, and we'll hear a lot more about this amorphous institution in the future. These are the 1,200-year-old bronze doors to the church. Charlemagne died in 814 and was buried here, and although I can't swear the music we're going to hear now was performed at his funeral, it is a lament for Charlemagne, a planctus caroli on the subject of his death. The original 9th century manuscript is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. As I mentioned earlier, the church here has been altered a good deal since Charlemagne's day, and none of the mosaics there now go back to his time, but there's no doubt he would still recognize the place. This is the interior looking east. Now you're looking back toward the west, and on the second floor you can see the so-called Throne of Charlemagne, which the latest research seems to indicate was made in his day. It was probably first used for the coronation of a king of Germany in 936, when Otto I took the job, and it was used for most subsequent coronations of kings of Germany until the 16th century. Here's a closer view of it. This is the dome now. And the 14th century choir. This is a map now showing the empire of Charlemagne at the time of his death in 814. The blue part he ruled most firmly, with somewhat less control over the red part and still less over the peach part, extending as far over as the Oder River in the east. Since Charlemagne had only one surviving legitimate son at his death, his empire hung together a generation longer than it would have if he had had more heirs among whom in the Frankish way to divide it. The successor to Charlemagne, then, was his son, Louis the first to bear that famous name in royal history, although Clovis is a Teutonic variant of the name, and he is known as Louis the Pious. Here's a picture that at least represents Louis the Pious on a manuscript page in a book of poems dedicated to him by Rabanus Maurus, the renowned abbot of Fulda. In French, Louis the Pious is called Louis the Debonair, of which pious doesn't seem quite the right translation. His reign is remembered for no great events, but it is to his credit that he still had what he was given at his own death in 840. He hoped to maintain the unity of the empire by leaving the title of emperor to his oldest son Lothair, along with a big piece of Central Europe stretching from Holland to northern Italy. But he also planned to give more or less what we think of as France to his son Pepin of Aquitaine, and more or less what we think of as Germany to his son, who became known as Louis the German. Unfortunately, the birth of a fourth son, known as Charles the Bald, by his second wife upset this plan. Louis wanted to give Charles something, but not surprisingly, none of the latter's older stepbrothers were anxious to give up anything they'd already come to think of as theirs. This led to a lot of fighting until Pepin died in 838, which allowed Charles the Bald to take France, and after their father Louis the Pious's death in 840, by the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the territory of his surviving sons was divided as we see it on this map. I should mention, too, that the Strasbourg Oath, by which Louis the German and Charles formed a temporary alliance against Lothair in 842, and the Treaty of Verdun itself, are often said to contain the oldest specimens of the French and German languages. The Hildebrandslied, though, copied by the monks of Fulda probably before 820, would seem to me to be an earlier example of German literature surviving. Anyway, in 870, Louis the German, by the Treaty of Mersenne, also acquired most of the territory of Lothair, though Charles the Bald got the Italian part along with the title of emperor. This is the reliquary of Pepin of Aquitaine, the son of Louis the Pious, whose death allowed Charles the Bald to claim France, as we've heard, in 838. It was given to the Abbey of Sainte-Foy-de-Conques, which we'll see later in the quarter, and this relic is still in the church. This reliquary, I should say, and as far as I know, the relic too, it has in it what is certainly one of the more peculiar relics in any church. You can consider it a research project to discover just what the relic is. It also has on it what is probably the earliest surviving image of the crucifixion in French art. Charles the Bald himself is the subject of this illuminated page in the Codex Aureus, the Golden Book of St. Emmeron, now in the Munich Staatsbibliothek. As a work of art, this displays a pretty good handling of spatial geometry. The canopy really does look three-dimensional, and Charles's legs are convincingly foreshortened. Charles the Bald is reckoned both the emperor and the king of France, but it is better to think of him as the latter. The title of emperor was eventually to settle in Germany for good with the coronation of Otto I, as we'll see. But we won't take time to sort out all the history of those who transiently claimed the title in the 50 years or so, somewhat less, between Charles the Bald and Otto. Charles's sobriquet, his nickname, the Bald, might lead you to take him less seriously than he should be taken. He's generally regarded as one of the more praiseworthy Carolingian rulers and did about as good a job as could be expected dealing with Vikings, Germans, and priests. This is the cover of the book, which contains the page you just saw, the Codex Aureus of St. Emmeron of Regensburg. There was a big theological fuss in Charles's day over determinism and free will, a recurring problem for the Church. At the Abbey of Rabanus Maurus at Fulda, a monk named Gottschalk got into trouble for arguing that God has preordained the course of the world, and that those who will go to heaven and hell have already been chosen. Gottschalk could quote St. Paul and St. Augustine to support his view, but it was considered heresy because it negated the redemptive power of Jesus. In this he was opposed by Archbishop Hincmar of Reims, who pointed out that Gottschalk's heresy also seemed to make God responsible for the sins of the damned. In 851, John Scotus Erigena, the most well-known and interesting scholar of the 9th century, and Irish thinker in residence at Charles the Bald's court, stepped into the conflict at the request of Hincmar. This is a detail from the Codex Aureus cover. Ultimately, Erigena wound up arguing that the doctrine of predestination can't be defended because we can't know anything about God at all. In his treatise De Divisione Naturae on the division of nature, he put this in a sort of dangerous way. He says, all things flow constantly from God as water flows from a spring and tend ever to return to him as water tends ever to return to its own level. Nature is eternal, moving by the dialectical process of division and return. We do not know what God is because he is infinite and therefore objectively unknowable. God himself does not know what he is because he is not anything. Therefore, nothing can be predicated of God literally or affirmatively. Literally, God is not because he transcends being. Well, in this work, he winds up then a kind of mystical pantheist and a worse heretic than Gottschalk, but he was protected by Charles. This is the way the cathedral at Fulda, about 50 miles northeast of Frankfurt, looks today. The abbey, which used to be here, was founded, as I mentioned earlier, by the English missionary St. Boniface in the 8th century. Einhard was born here in the town and educated at the monastic school. And in the days of Rabanus Maurus, Boniface's successor as abbot here and as Archbishop of Mainz as well, the monastery school at Fulda was the most important intellectual center in Germany, if not in all Europe. The only copies of the works of Tacitus and Suetonius to survive 2 Carolingian times were preserved here, and much attention was given to classical as well as Christian studies. Rabanus Maurus himself wrote all sorts of things, theological treatises, of course, history, poetry, and even music. The hymn Iste Confessor, which is in the Antiphonale Monasticum to be sung at Vespers on the feast day of a confessor bishop, is thought to be his work. And we'll hear it now while we see a few more examples of the craftsmanship of the 9th century. This is the first cover of the Lindau Gospel Book now in the Pierpont Morgan Library. One of the most artistically productive areas of Europe at this time was around Lake Constance. This was made at the Abbey of Lindau at the east end of the lake. St. Gall is just to the south of Lake Constance, and this clearly shows British influence, whether from St. Gall or elsewhere. This is the second cover of the same book, made 50 years later at Reims, and it shows no Anglo-Saxon or Celtic influence. This is a detail from that cover. This is a page from the Bible of Charles the Bald, Latin Codex number 1 in the Bibliothèque Nationale. This is a 9th century Assumption in ivory, which used to be part of a book cover. And this is the cover of the Psalter of Charles the Bald in the Bibliothèque Nationale also. It's important to notice that almost all the books or pages thereof which we're seeing are devoted to Holy Scripture. Classical texts, although they were copied in great numbers, rarely got the same impressive treatment. It was not so much, I'm afraid, that the 9th century was devoted to books, but that it was devoted to religion, and that led to the making of such fine texts and covers. The subject here is the 56th Psalm, in which the psalmist is beset by all sorts of problems, and Charles the Bald himself probably felt much the same way by the time he died in 877. His successors in France, like the Merovingian successors of Clovis, were generally an undistinguished bunch. They have names like Louis the Stutterer and Charles the Stupid, and it's the latter who's remembered for giving much of northern France to Rollo and his Vikings, or Norsemen, from which time it became known as Normandy, and this Rollo is a direct ancestor of William the Conqueror. This is a Carolingian drinking horn in the Aachen Cathedral treasury. In 987, when Louis V, the last Carolingian, died leaving no sons, the French nobility chose a nobleman, Hugh Capet, to take over, and with him began the Capetian dynasty, the dynasty that in its various branches, Valois, Bourbon, and so on, was to rule France until the Revolution and for a time even after that. Kenneth Clark calls the 10th century the most despised and rejected of centuries, and there is today hardly anything above ground that was made in that era. It was the darkest of the Dark Ages. This is the crypt of Saint Benin in Dijon, and it's pretty much into places like this you have to go if you want to see what survives from it. But around 1000, just about the time Hugh Capet was crowned, things began to change. And we'll see about this after the break